Welcome to Motivate Lounge Coffee Shop Chat, where inspiration brews with every conversation. We dive deep into finding your path to success, no matter where you are in life. Grab your coffee, pull up a chair, and let's get motivated.
Welcome to the deep dive, where we like to go deep on interesting stuff. Today, it's all about, toxic friendships. We'll
Yeah.
be talking about why those relationships are hard to deal with and how they affect us and also how to like heal and move on from them.
Yeah, I think it's something that most people have experienced at some point, or at least, tried to figure out.
Right, exactly. And to help us with this deep dive, we've got some really interesting stuff to work with. We've got this personal story from her culture about a college friend group that like completely falls apart. And then there's Charlie Health with advice on, boundaries and protecting yourself and then a more, I guess, psychological take from Psychology Today on toxic people in general.
And what's interesting is that while these sources come at it from different angles, they all kind of agree on one thing.
Yeah.
Recognizing when something's toxic is like super important for, our own well-being and having healthier relationships in the future.
Yeah. And here's a thought from Psychology Today that I hadn't really considered before. Growing up around toxic behavior can actually make it harder to recognize and accept
Right.
healthy, loving relationships later on.
Right, that makes sense. If you're exposed to unhealthy dynamics for a long time, it can like distort your perception of what's normal.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you mean. So let's start with that personal story from her culture. It really shows how, like, even those really close friendships can go bad in surprising ways.
Okay, so this story is about this woman's experience in college. She like becomes best friends with this group of people during freshman year. They're inseparable, do everything together, even end up living together. It sounds pretty great, right?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, anyone who's been through those intense college friendships can relate.
Yeah.
You're basically always together, sharing everything.
Right, exactly. But then things start to change. Jealousy comes in, passive aggression becomes like the normal way of communicating, and there's just this complete breakdown. The author even describes a situation where like one of her so-called friends is openly flirting with her boyfriend.
Wow, that's rough. It really shows how those little digs and betrayals can like really hurt and damage your trust.
Right. And what's so interesting about this story is that it doesn't just like tell you what happened. The author really goes into how she felt after this whole friend group thing blew up.
Yeah, that was the most insightful part for me too. It's not just about like escaping the toxic situation, but dealing with the hurt and figuring out how to move on. In fact, the article even says that sometimes these friendship breakups can be even harder than romantic ones.
Yeah, that might seem surprising, but it makes sense when you think about like the expectations we have for friendships.
Yeah, there's that sense of loyalty and unconditional support that we associate with close friends. So when that trust is broken, it can feel like a much deeper betrayal than when a romantic relationship ends.
Right, especially because we're often less, I guess, prepared for friendships to end. We go into romantic relationships knowing that, there's a chance it won't last forever. But with friendships, there's often this assumption that they'll be there for the long haul.
Right, totally. And the article also points out that it's even tougher when you're like living with a toxic friend.
Yeah.
You can't just avoid them, right? You're stuck in that environment all the time feeling anxious.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine trying to create a peaceful, supportive living space when you're constantly on edge around your roommate. That kind of stress can be really draining.
Totally. So how do you even begin to deal with all that emotional baggage? The article thankfully has some good advice, and it all starts with forgiving yourself.
Yeah, that's a crucial point that I think a lot of people miss. We tend to focus on whether or not to forgive the toxic friend, but the real work often begins with self-forgiveness.
Because it's so easy to blame ourselves when a friendship goes wrong. We think, what could I have done differently? Was I somehow responsible for their behavior?
Right, it's that lingering guilt and shame that can really prevent you from healing. The article suggests a few steps to move towards self-forgiveness, and I think they're really powerful.
Okay, so what's the first step?
The first step is recognizing that, you can't control other people's actions. You can't force them to be a good friend no matter how much you care.
Right. Yeah, it's easy to think we could somehow change them or like stop them from being toxic.
Yeah. And that leads to the second step. Remembering that you probably did try to make the friendship work. You probably didn't just like give up at the first sign of trouble.
Yeah, we tend to forget to give ourselves credit for the effort we put in. We focus on how the friendship failed instead of, like, acknowledging that we tried to fix it.
It's important to recognize those efforts because it helps us get to that third step, accepting that everyone makes mistakes. You know, we're not perfect, and that includes us.
Yeah, that can be a tough one to swallow, especially if you're someone who tends to hold themselves to really high standards.
It is, but it's a key part of letting go of that self-blame. And then finally, the article really emphasizes focusing on the future and not dwelling on the past.
So it's not about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt, but more about learning from it and growing from those experiences.
Exactly. Holding on to that resentment or guilt will just keep you stuck. And this leads to another important point that her culture brings up, the importance of focusing on your own happiness after a toxic friendship ends.
It's like once you let go of that self-blame and you start to forgive yourself, you can finally focus on rebuilding your life and surrounding yourself with good people.
Right. And the article gives some really practical advice for doing just that. Things like using a planner to stay organized, setting goals, and even just making sure your living space is clean and clutter-free.
Those might seem like small things, but they can make a huge difference in how we feel about ourselves and our lives. It's about taking control and creating a space that's good for our well-being.
Exactly. And her culture even talks about this idea of rediscovering yourself after a toxic friendship ends. It's almost like you get to figure out who you are all over again outside of that unhealthy dynamic.
That's such a powerful idea. It means that even though these experiences are really painful, they can also be opportunities for growth and self-discovery.
Absolutely. Now let's switch gears for a bit and bring in some of the insights from Psychology Today. This article has a more clinical approach looking at what makes a person or relationship toxic.
Yeah, I think that's helpful because while those personal stories are relatable, it's also good to have a more general way of understanding these patterns of behavior.
Right. Psychology Today starts by defining what we mean by toxic when we're talking about relationships. It's not just about someone being, difficult or annoying. It's about a pattern of behavior that hurts or undermines other people.
So it's really about the impact of their actions, not just their intentions. What are some examples of those harmful behaviors?
Well, think about someone who always puts down your feelings or accomplishments, or someone who manipulates you into doing things you don't want to do, or someone who always makes you feel like you're walking on eggshells around them.
Oh yeah, those are good examples. It's about that constant chipping away at your self-esteem and your sense of security.
And it's important to remember that those behaviors can be subtle too. It's not always like big fights or confrontations. Sometimes it's those small little things that wear you down over time.
That's why it's so important to be able to spot those red flags early on. But that can be hard to do, especially if you've been around toxic behavior a lot in the past.
You're right. Psychology Today and Charlie Health actually both give a really helpful list of red flags to watch out for. And you might recognize some of them from that college friend group story we talked about earlier.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about those red flags. What are some of the key things to be aware of?
Well, one of the big ones is how this person treats other people. Do they complain about people behind their backs all the time? Do they have a history of falling out with friends or family? That's a sign that they might not be as trustworthy or loyal as they seem.
It's like that saying, if they'll gossip with you, they'll gossip about you.
Exactly. Another important thing to consider is how they handle conflict. Do they avoid talking openly and honestly? Do they have trouble apologizing or taking responsibility for their actions?
Or do they always turn it around and make you feel like you're the one at fault, even when they're clearly in the wrong?
That's a classic sign of toxic behavior. It's all about avoiding responsibility and staying in control.
And probably the most important red flag is how they make you feel. Do you always feel drained or anxious after spending time with them? Do you feel like you have to be super careful around them, like you're walking on eggshells?
Those are big red flags. If someone constantly makes you feel bad about yourself or undermines your confidence or just drains your energy, that's a sign that the relationship isn't healthy.
It's like your gut is telling you something's wrong, even if you can't quite explain it.
Exactly. And it's important to listen to those instincts. You deserve to be in relationships where you feel supported and respected and valued.
So what about validation? How does that fit into toxic relationships?
That's another key thing to pay attention to. Does this person validate your feelings and needs and accomplishments? Do they celebrate your successes or do they feel threatened by them? Do they really listen to you or do they just brush off your concerns?
A true friend will be your biggest supporter. They'll want to see you do well, and they'll be there for you when you're struggling.
Exactly. And they'll also be honest and trustworthy. Do you find yourself constantly wondering if this person is being sincere or if they're hiding things from you?
Yeah, that lack of transparency can really hurt a relationship. It destroys trust and makes you feel uneasy.
Right. And lastly, pay attention to their overall mood. Are they always negative or complaining or quick to get angry?
Those negative vibes can be contagious. If you're around them all the time, it can start to affect how you feel and how you see things.
Absolutely. So those are just a few of the red flags to watch out for. Obviously, no one's perfect and everyone has their flaws.
That's true. It's not about expecting someone to be perfect, but it's about recognizing those patterns of behavior that are consistently hurtful or disrespectful.
Exactly. If someone shows one or two of these red flags every now and then, it might not be a big deal. But if you see a pattern of these behaviors, it's a good idea to step back and really think about the relationship.
Because ultimately, you deserve to be in relationships that make you feel good about yourself and support your well-being.
And sometimes that means being strong enough to walk away from relationships that aren't good for you, even if it's hard.
Which brings us to the advice from Charlie Health. They really stress the importance of setting boundaries with toxic people and putting your own well-being first.
What's interesting about their approach is that it's all about setting clear boundaries. It's not just about avoiding toxic people altogether, it's about figuring out how to deal with them in a way that protects your own well-being.
Right, because let's face it, sometimes you just can't, completely avoid a toxic person.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a family member or someone you work with or someone you see socially sometimes.
Exactly, and that's where those boundaries are really important. Charlie Health says you should start by figuring out exactly which behaviors are toxic and then tell the person that those behaviors are not okay.
So it's about, setting limits and letting them know what will happen if they cross those lines.
Exactly. And those consequences could be things like spending less time with them or ending conversations when they get disrespectful or even, leaving situations where you think they might act toxic.
So it's really about putting your own well-being first, even if it means making some hard choices.
Absolutely. And sometimes, even when you try to set boundaries, the person keeps acting toxic. In those cases, Charlie Health suggests maybe it's time to walk away from that relationship completely.
Yeah, that could be a really tough decision, especially if you've known the person for a long time or you have strong feelings for them.
It is. It's not something to take lightly, but sometimes walking away is the healthiest thing for both of you.
It's about realizing that you can't make someone change, but you can choose to get out of a situation that's hurting you.
Right. Now, one thing that both Psychology Today and Red talk about is this idea that toxic people can change, but you can't change them.
That's so true. It's tempting to think that if we just love them enough, or if they just understood how much they're hurting us, that they would magically become a better person.
Yeah, it's natural to want to help people we care about. But the truth is that real change has to come from inside them.
So even though it's great if someone admits they're being toxic and wants to work on themselves, we can't force them to do it.
And when you try to force change, it usually backfires. It can lead to resentment, manipulation, and even more toxic behavior.
It's about knowing that we have a responsibility to ourselves to take care of our own well-being, and sometimes that means accepting that we can't fix other people.
You're right. And Red ends with a really interesting question. They ask, if you seem to attract toxic people over and over again, could there be a reason why you're drawn to those types of dynamics?
That's a good point. It makes you wonder if maybe we subconsciously look for familiar patterns, even if those patterns are unhealthy.
It's like we're comfortable with what we know, even if it's toxic.
Almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we don't think we deserve healthy relationships, maybe we sabotage ourselves by choosing people who just confirm those beliefs.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. If you see yourself in that cycle, it might be good to talk to a therapist about those underlying reasons.
It's about understanding our own patterns and making conscious choices to break free from those unhealthy relationships.
Exactly. And remember, even if you've been through a toxic friendship or relationship, it doesn't mean you're, destined to repeat those patterns. You can learn from those experiences, set healthy boundaries, and build relationships that are really supportive and fulfilling.
That's such a great message. There's always hope, and you can heal.
And there are resources out there to help you. Therapy, support groups, even just talking to a friend or family member can make a huge difference.
Yeah, you're not alone in this. So this has been a deep dive into a really complicated and often painful topic.
But hopefully you've learned something from it. Knowing more about toxic relationships is the first step to breaking free from them.
Right. So remember, Watch out for those red flags. Put yourself first, set healthy boundaries, and know when it's time to walk away.
And don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. There are people who care about you and want you to be happy.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to wrap it up for today. We hope you found this deep dive helpful and insightful. Until next time, take care of yourselves and keep learning.
That's a wrap for today's Motivate Lounge coffee shop chat, where inspiration meets action. Keep chasing your goals and stay motivated. If you enjoyed this episode, like, subscribe, and share Motivate Lounge on YouTube.